Silverware chimed against porcelain, masking the soft, vicious giggles at the far end of the mahogany table. Miss Beatrice Harlow kept her eyes firmly pinned on her untouched venison. She was accustomed to the casual cruelty of polite society. Governesses were meant to blend into the damask wallpaper, not to be carved up under the polite knives of bored aristocrats craving sport. They chose the wrong prey tonight, and they entirely forgot about the Duke sitting silently at the head of the table. The Harrington estate smelled perpetually of lemon oil, damp wool, and desperation. It was a grand house, built 3 generations ago, when the Harrington family actually possessed wealth to match their ambition. Now, the sprawling manor in Somerset was a facade. The mortar was crumbling, the tapestries were fading in the afternoon sun, and Lady Cecilia Harrington was terrified the world would notice. Beatrice Harlow noticed. She noticed the slight fraying at the hem of Lady Harrington's morning gowns. She noticed the way the footman watered down the claret before bringing it to the dining room. It was her job to notice things, and her survival depended on never pointing them out. Beatrice was the governess. 24 years old, unmarried, and entirely devoid of the decorative qualities society demanded of women. Her hair was a sensible, dishwater brown, pulled back so tightly her scalp ached by evening. Her dresses were grey bombazine, heavy and rigid, designed to conceal any hint of a figure. She looked exactly as a governess should, severely plain, eternally faded, and completely invisible. "Keep your back straight, Henry," Beatrice murmured, tapping the edge of the slate with a piece of chalk. 7-year-old Henry Harrington slumped further into his chair, dragging his chin across his Latin primer. "It is raining, Miss Harlow. The words are drowning. The words are perfectly dry. It is your attention that is sinking." Beatrice didn't raise her voice. She never did. She reached out, placing a firm but gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, righting his posture. The heavy oak door to the nursery swung open, rattling the hinges. Lady Harrington swept into the room, trailing the sharp scent of lavender water and panic. Behind her stood Arabella, her eldest daughter. Arabella was 19, blonde, and possessed the kind of breathtaking, vacant beauty that men of the ton happily ruined themselves for. "Miss Harlow." Lady Harrington didn't look at Beatrice. She looked at the window, checking the state of the gravel drive. "Are the children presentable?" "Henry is studying his Latin, my lady. The girls are resting." "Never mind the Latin." Lady Harrington wrung her pale hands together. "The Duke of Rothwell has passed the village toll gate. He is early. He is infuriatingly early." Beatrice stood, smoothing her grey skirt. "Shall I keep the children in the nursery for the afternoon?" "Of course you shall keep them in the nursery," Lady Harrington snapped, her composure cracking. "The Duke is not coming to inspect my offspring. He is coming for the hunting and—" She glanced at Arabella, her eyes gleaming with sudden, terrifying calculation. "And for the company, Arabella, pinch your cheeks. You look like a corpse." Arabella sighed, dutifully slapping her own face until the pale skin bloomed pink. "I don't see why he is arriving today. The dinner party is not until tomorrow evening." "Dukes do as they please," her mother hissed. Philip Sinclair, the Duke of Rothwell, was a phantom in the gossip rags. He rarely came to town. He did not dance at Almack's. He spent his time entirely consumed by his massive estates in the north and his investments in the shipping trade. He was brutally wealthy, quietly powerful, and notoriously difficult to impress. He was also 32 and unmarried. To Lady Harrington, he was a lottery ticket walking on 2 legs. "Keep them quiet, Miss Harlow," Lady Harrington commanded, finally throwing a glance at Beatrice. Her eyes swept over the governess's severe bun and drab dress, registering her not as a person, but as a piece of functional furniture. "If I hear a single shriek from this floor, I will dock your wages." "Yes, my lady." The door slammed shut. Beatrice sat back down. Henry was staring at her, his eyes wide. "Is a duke like a king, Miss Harlowe?" the boy asked. "A duke is just a man, Henry," Beatrice said quietly, pulling the Latin primer back toward the center of the desk. "He bleeds red, and he puts his boots on one foot at a time. Now, back to the verbs." But as the afternoon wore on, the house practically vibrated with the tension of the Duke's arrival. Beatrice could hear the frantic rushing of servants in the corridors below, the shouting of the butler, the heavy thud of trunks being hauled up the grand staircase. Beatrice stayed by the nursery window. Through the rain-streaked glass, she watched a sleek, black carriage pull up to the front steps. There was no crest plastered boastfully on the door. It was understated, expensive. A footman rushed out with an umbrella. The carriage door opened. A man stepped out. Beatrice could not see his face through the driving rain, only the broad set of his shoulders beneath a heavy, dark driving coat. He didn't wait for the footman. He simply turned, grabbed a battered leather satchel from the carriage floor, and walked up the steps with long, ground-eating strides. He moved like a man who was profoundly irritated to be exactly where he was. Beatrice stepped back from the glass, letting the heavy velvet curtain fall. By the following evening, the Harrington estate was a war zone of culinary and social preparation. The grand dining room had been polished until it gleamed like a mirror. Silver candelabras were loaded with expensive beeswax candles. The kitchen was in a state of chaotic meltdown, attempting to produce a 7-course dinner that would somehow convince the Duke of Rothwell that the Harringtons were his absolute equals in taste and refinement. Beatrice was in the nursery, attempting to mend a tear in her only good wool shawl, when the panic finally reached her floor. The door flew open. Mrs. Potts, the housekeeper, stood there, her face the color of boiled cabbage. "Miss Harlowe, downstairs. Now." Beatrice didn't flinch. She methodically pushed her needle into the pin cushion. "Has Henry broken something?" "Worse," Mrs. Potts wheezed, clutching her chest. "Lord and Lady Danbury's carriage threw a wheel on the turnpike. They aren't coming." Beatrice failed to see the tragedy. "That is unfortunate for them. I am sure the kitchen can adjust the portions." "You don't understand." Mrs. Potts stepped into the room, gripping Beatrice by the arm with surprising strength. "That leaves 13. 13 at the table, Miss Harlowe. Lady Harrington is having palpitations in the drawing room. She refuses to seat 13. It is an omen of death." Beatrice sighed internally. The aristocracy and their superstitions. "She wishes me to come down and fetch something?" "She wishes you to sit." Mrs. Potts pulled her toward the door. "You are to be the 14th, to break the bad luck." Beatrice planted her feet. Her heavy leather boots squeaked against the floorboards. "Absolutely not. I am the governess. It is entirely inappropriate." "It is an order from her ladyship," Mrs. Potts snapped, panic overriding her usual mild temper. "Dinner is in 20 minutes. You will wash your face, you will put on whatever it is you consider your best gown, and you will sit at the very bottom of the table. You are not to speak. You are not to eat the expensive cuts of meat. You are a placeholder. A lump of clay to keep the devil away. Now hurry." 10 minutes later, Beatrice stood before the small, cracked mirror in her tiny attic room. She owned exactly one dress that wasn't meant for chalk dust and ink stains. It was a dark, muted navy silk. It had belonged to her mother. It was at least a decade out of fashion, the waistline slightly too low, the sleeves lacking the modern puff. It was austere. It offered no apologies. She splashed cold water on her face, pinching some color into her cheeks just as Arabella had done, though with far less enthusiasm. She did not attempt to curl her hair. She twisted it back into its severe, unyielding knot at the nape of her neck. She looked entirely out of place. Good. She wanted them to know she was there under duress. When Beatrice descended the servants' stairs and slipped into the corridor leading to the dining room, the guests were already filing in. The air was thick with expensive perfumes, roasted meats, and the low, buzzing hum of forced laughter. Beatrice waited in the shadows near the door until the lords and ladies had taken their seats. She watched Lady Harrington orchestrate the arrangement like a battlefield general. Arabella was seated directly to the right of the Duke. From her vantage point, Beatrice finally got a clear look at Philip Sinclair. He was not conventionally handsome. His jaw was too square. His nose had a slight bump at the bridge as if it had been broken and poorly set, and his hair was dark and unruly, lacking the pomaded sheen of the other gentlemen. But he possessed a gravitational pull. He sat back in his chair, completely relaxed, yet intensely alert. His dark eyes scanned the room, stripping away the gilt and the glamour, seeing the cracks in the mortar. He looked bored. No, Beatrice realized with a jolt of recognition. Not bored. Exhausted. He looked like a man tired of listening to people who had nothing to say. "Miss Harlowe," a harsh whisper hissed in her ear. It was the butler, Higgins. "Stop loitering. To your seat. Quickly, before the soup is served." Beatrice stepped into the light. The dining room was a blinding display of candlelight and sparkling jewels. Beatrice kept her chin parallel to the floor, her eyes fixed on the empty chair at the very foot of the table, nearest the draughty door leading to the kitchens. As she walked the length of the room, the conversation near her died out, replaced by a ripple of confusion. Lord Cavil, a man whose debts were as legendary as his malicious wit, paused with his wine glass halfway to his mouth. He stared at Beatrice's outdated navy dress. "Good God," he murmured loudly to the woman beside him. "Did they drag the scullery maid up to serve?" A few stifled titters echoed around the lower half of the table. Beatrice did not flush. She did not look away. She pulled out her own chair, the footman purposefully ignoring her, and sat down, folding her hands tightly in her lap. At the head of the table, Philip Sinclair's eyes shifted. The movement was tiny, almost imperceptible. But over the flickering flames of the candelabras, his gaze locked onto the woman in the outdated navy silk at the far end of the room. The turtle soup was served. It was thick, rich, and heavily spiced, meant to obscure the fact that the turtle was likely far past its prime. Beatrice picked up her spoon. She was starving. The nursery tea had consisted of stale bread and a bruised apple. She took a small, careful sip, keeping her elbows pinned strictly to her sides. "Tell me, Lady Harrington," Lord Cavil began, his voice carrying easily over the clatter of silver. He leaned back, his eyes fixed mockingly on Beatrice. "Is it a new fashion in Somerset to dine with the hired help? I confess, London is so dreadfully behind the times. Perhaps next season we shall invite the chimney sweeps to Almack's." A loud burst of laughter erupted from Arabella. She covered her mouth with a lace fan, batting her eyelashes at the Duke. "Oh, Lord Cavil, you are terrible. We were merely short a guest. Miss Harlowe is our governess. She is simply here to ward off bad luck." "How wonderfully utilitarian of her," Cavil drawled. He turned his gaze directly to Beatrice. "Miss Harlowe, is it? Tell me, what does a governess think about when sitting amongst her betters? Does the glare of the diamonds hurt your eyes?" The table quieted. It was a blood sport. They were waiting for the mouse to squeak. Beatrice slowly lowered her spoon. She met Lord Cavil's gaze. Her face was a mask of polite indifference. "I think about mathematics, my lord," Beatrice said. Her voice was surprisingly clear. It lacked the breathless, high-pitched flutter affected by the ladies of the ton. It was low, grounded, and steady. Cavil raised an eyebrow. Mathematics? Yes, Beatrice replied. I was just calculating the cost of the candelabras on this table and weighing it against the well-known ledgers of your tailors in Bond Street. It is a fascinating exercise in balancing fictional wealth against physical reality. Total silence slammed down on the dining room. Lord Cavil's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of crimson. His gambling debts were the worst kept secret in England. To have them pointed out, not just in public, but by a servant, was unthinkable. Arabella gasped loudly. Miss Harlowe, how dare you speak to a guest in such a manner? Lady Harrington looked as though she might slide out of her chair in a dead faint. Miss Harlowe, you will hold your tongue, or you will leave this room immediately. I apologize, my lady, Beatrice said smoothly, picking up her spoon again. Lord Cavil asked for my thoughts. I merely provided them. I shall endeavour to think of something less factual for the remainder of the evening. At the head of the table, a sound broke the tension. It was a low, rough sound. It took a moment for the surrounding guests to identify it, because they had never heard it before. The Duke of Rothwell was laughing. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a genuine, chest-deep laugh that rumbled through the quiet room. Philip leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy mahogany table, ignoring every rule of posture he had been beaten with as a child. He looked past Arabella, past the horrified Lady Harrington, and stared directly down the length of the table at Beatrice. Factual reality, Philip repeated, his dark eyes gleaming with sudden, sharp interest. A rare commodity at a dinner party. Miss Harlowe, I believe it was. Beatrice looked up. The Duke was looking at her. Not through her. At her. Yes, Your Grace, she said evenly. And do your mathematical exercises extend to the rest of the room, Miss Harlowe? He asked, his voice cutting through the stifling air of the room like a cold wind. Or is Lord Cavil the sole beneficiary of your accounting? I generally keep my ledgers private, Your Grace, Beatrice said, unless prompted. A wise policy? Philip picked up his wine glass, twirling the stem between his long fingers. He did not look away from her. I find most people cannot afford the truth. Arabella, sensing the spotlight drifting violently away from her, forced a high, brittle laugh. Your Grace, you mustn't encourage her. Governesses are prone to forgetting their place if they are indulged. Miss Harlowe is quite plain in her manners. Plain, Philip mused, the word rolling off his tongue slowly. He finally turned his head to look at Arabella. The amusement vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, flat stare that made the young woman shrink back into her chair. I find, Lady Arabella, that those who call others plain are often just upset that they are no longer the most interesting thing in the room. He turned back to his soup. The silence that followed was suffocating. Beatrice stared at her plate, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had won the skirmish, but she had undoubtedly lost the war. Lady Harrington would dismiss her without a character reference in the morning. She would be on the streets. But as the footman moved in to clear the soup bowls, Beatrice glanced up, just for a fraction of a second. Philip Sinclair was already looking at her, and for the first time since she had arrived at the Harrington estate, Beatrice Harlowe felt completely, dangerously seen. Beatrice packed her trunk in the bruised, grey light of dawn. It did not take long. She possessed 3 dresses, 4 pairs of heavily darned woolen stockings, a modest collection of undergarments, and a worn leather copy of John Locke's essays that had belonged to her father. She folded the navy silk dress last, her hands lingering on the slightly frayed collar. She expected the footman to rap on her door at any moment with her walking papers and half a month's wages. She knew the rules of the game. A governess was a ghost. Ghosts who spoke, especially ghosts who spoke back to lords, were promptly exorcised. A sharp knock rattled the thin wood of her door. Beatrice closed the trunk, fastened the brass buckles with a dull click, and stood up. Enter. It was not a footman. It was Lady Harrington's personal maid, a gaunt woman named Miller who always looked as though she had just swallowed a lemon. Her ladyship requires you in her dressing room. Immediately. Beatrice followed the maid down 2 flights of stairs, leaving the draughty, unfinished corridors of the servants' quarters for the thick, muffled carpets of the family wing. The air here was heavy with the smell of coal smoke and expensive rosewater. Lady Harrington was seated at her vanity, her face slathered in a white paste meant to bleach away the creeping signs of age. She did not turn around when Beatrice entered. She spoke to the governess's reflection in the glass. "You are a plague, Miss Harlowe," Lady Harrington said, her voice dropping the polite veneer she wore downstairs. It was a cold, hard sound. "I apologize, my lady," Beatrice said evenly, staring at a spot on the wall just above Lady Harrington's head. "I have packed my belongings. I shall be out of the house before the guests rise for breakfast." "You will do no such thing." Beatrice blinked, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second. She dragged her gaze down to meet her employer's eyes in the mirror. "My lady, if I throw you out into the rain this morning, it will cause a scene. I do not abide scenes." Lady Harrington picked up a silver-backed brush and slammed it onto the vanity table. "The Duke of Rothwell inquired about you this morning to my husband. He found your little display of insolence refreshing. The man is a brute who clearly enjoys watching the polite world burn. But he is a brute with £100,000 a year." Beatrice remained utterly still. The Duke had asked about her. A cold spike of anxiety pierced her stomach. That was worse than being fired. That was being noticed. "If he finds you missing," Lady Harrington continued, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table, "he will ask questions. He will think us petty. We cannot afford to look petty in front of him. Therefore, you will remain. But you are confined to the upper floors. You are to take your meals in the nursery. You are not to speak to the guests. You are to become entirely invisible again. Do I make myself clear?" "Perfectly, my lady." "Get out." Beatrice retreated. She did not feel relief. She felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of a trap snapping shut. By mid-morning, the rain had settled into a persistent, miserable drizzle. Henry was struggling through his mathematics, his small face scrunched in a scowl. Beatrice needed a different primer, something simpler to explain the concept of fractions. The only other text was in the main library on the ground floor. She calculated the risk. The guests would be in the breakfast room, tearing into platters of eggs and kippers, safely contained on the opposite side of the house. She slipped down the back stairs, moving silently in her soft-soled boots. The grand library smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and wood ash. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, letting in the grey, watery light of the overcast sky. Beatrice moved quickly to the section holding the educational texts, running a finger along the spines. She found the primer, pulled it from the shelf, and turned to leave. "You move very quietly, Miss Harlowe, like a soldier behind enemy lines." Beatrice froze. In a high-backed leather wing chair, turned slightly away from the door and previously hidden from her view, sat Philip Sinclair. He wasn't wearing his formal coat. He wore a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, a dark waistcoat unbuttoned at the top. He had a thick ledger balanced on his knee and a glass of amber liquid in his hand. Beatrice felt a hot flush creep up her neck. "Your Grace, I apologize. I believed the room to be empty." "It was, until you entered." Philip closed the ledger, setting it on the small table beside him. He did not stand up. He looked at her with that same intense scrutiny from the night before. It was not a leering look. It was the look of an appraiser assessing the structural integrity of a building. Fleeing the battlefield? Retrieving a book for my pupil, Your Grace, and retreating to the nursery, safely out of sight. He took a slow sip from his glass. Lady Harrington's orders, I presume? A quarantine to ensure you don't infect the rest of us with a bout of honesty? Lady Harrington is my employer, Beatrice said, her voice completely flat. It is her house. She dictates where the furniture is placed. Philip's mouth twitched. It was almost a smile. And you are the furniture. I am the governess. The distinction is minimal. He stood up then. The library felt suddenly much smaller. He was a tall man, built with the kind of dense, functional muscle that did not come from fencing academies or polite riding paths. He walked toward her, stopping a respectful 3 paces away. You did not look like furniture last night, Miss Harlow. You looked like a woman who was perfectly willing to gut Lord Cavil with a butter knife. Beatrice gripped the primer to her chest. I spoke out of turn. It was a lapse in judgment. It was the only interesting thing that has happened in this house since I arrived. Philip tilted his head, studying the severe lines of her face, the tight pull of her hair, the drab grey of her mourning dress. Why do you hide, Miss Harlow? The question was so direct, it felt like a physical blow. Beatrice raised her chin. I do not hide, Your Grace. I survive. You possess a title, vast estates, and an income that insulates you from consequence. If you insult a lord, it is considered an eccentricity. If I insult a lord, I am thrown onto the street to starve. I do not have the luxury of a personality. Philip held her gaze. The amusement vanished from his eyes, replaced by something darker, heavier. No, I suppose you don't. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the steady drumming of the rain against the tall windows. It was an uncomfortable silence, thick with unspoken observations. Go back to your nursery, Miss Harlow, Philip said quietly, turning back toward his chair. Before Lady Harrington sends the hounds after you. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She turned and walked out of the library, her spine rigid. But as she climbed the stairs, her hands were trembling. The rain broke by early afternoon the following day, leaving the grounds of the estate a treacherous, muddy bog. This did not deter the hunting party. Dozens of beaters, gamekeepers, and yapping hounds swarmed the front lawns. The gentlemen wore pristine tweed and polished riding boots, carrying custom-made fowling pieces. The ladies, wrapped in heavy furs despite the mild autumn temperature, gathered on the terrace to wave them off. Beatrice was shivering. Lady Harrington, in a fit of spite, dressed up as maternal concern, had ordered Beatrice to take Henry outside for fresh air. The fresh air was damp, biting, and smelled strongly of wet dog. Beatrice wore her grey wool coat, which was missing 2 buttons, and possessed the insulating qualities of a wet napkin. She kept Henry near the edge of the woods, far away from the terrace and the chaotic assembly of the hunting party. They were collecting fallen oak leaves, pressing them flat between the pages of an old sketch pad. Why do they shoot the birds, Miss Harlow? Henry asked, his small fingers digging into the wet earth to retrieve a particularly vibrant red leaf. We have enough chickens in the coop. It is not about food, Henry, Beatrice said, scanning the tree line. The damp cold was seeping through the soles of her boots. It is about sport. It is a demonstration of skill and control. It seems mean, the boy muttered. Many things in the world are mean. Our job is to endure them. A sudden, sharp crack echoed across the fields, followed by a chorus of overlapping shots. Henry jumped, dropping his leaf. Beatrice placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, though she too disliked the violent sound tearing through the quiet afternoon. A few moments later, the heavy thud of hooves approached from the path behind them. Beatrice turned, pulling Henry slightly behind her. Philip Sinclair rode out of the trees on a massive, restless bay gelding. He was separated from the main party, his shotgun resting casually across the pommel of his saddle. He wore a dark green coat that was already splattered with her mud. He did not look like a duke enjoying a country holiday. He looked like a man patrolling a border he thoroughly despised. He saw Beatrice and pulled back on the reins. The horse danced sideways, snorting plumes of white steam into the chilly air. "Miss Harlowe," Philip called out. He easily swung his long leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, landing in the mud with a heavy squelch. He tied the reins to a low-hanging branch and walked toward them. "Your Grace," Beatrice said, dropping into a shallow, perfunctory curtsy. "We are keeping out of the way of the guns." "You are freezing," Philip observed bluntly, his eyes dropping to her shivering hands, which were bare. "I am perfectly adequate." "You are a terrible liar." He looked down at Henry, who was staring up at the giant man with wide, slightly fearful eyes. "What are you doing in the mud, boy?" Henry swallowed hard, looking at Beatrice for permission to speak. She gave a microscopic nod. "Collecting leaves, Your Grace. For science." Philip's lips twitched. Science. A noble pursuit. Better than shooting terrified pheasants. "Then why do you do it?" Henry blurted out. Beatrice stiffened. "Henry, mind your manners." "No, let him ask," Philip said, crouching down so he was eye level with the boy. He rested his forearms on his knees, utterly unconcerned about the damp earth staining his expensive trousers. "I do it, Henry, because when you are a man grown, society expects certain things of you. They expect you to ride, to shoot, to drink bad port, and to pretend you enjoy the company of fools. If you refuse to play the game entirely, they call you mad. So, you play a little. Just enough to keep them satisfied." Henry frowned, trying to process the complex, adult hypocrisy. "That sounds exhausting." "It is profoundly exhausting," Philip agreed softly. He stood up, his gaze shifting back to Beatrice. The wind caught a stray lock of her dishwater brown hair, whipping it across her cheek. She reached up to pin it back, her fingers stiff with cold. "You see the cage too, don't you?" Philip asked, his voice low, pitched so only she could hear over the rustle of the wind. Beatrice dropped her hand. "My cage is made of iron, Your Grace. Yours is made of gold. Do not equate the two. If you tire of your cage, you can walk out the door and buy a ship to India. If I tire of mine, I freeze to death in a ditch." Philip didn't flinch at the sharpness of her tone. He actually stepped closer. The smell of wet wool, leather and gunpowder clung to him. "You think my wealth makes me free. It merely makes me a target. Every person in that house," he gestured vaguely toward the distant manor, "looks at me and sees a ledger. They see a vault to be cracked. Lady Harrington would happily feed me to her daughter if she thought it would secure my bank accounts. That is the nature of their world." "And your world?" he challenged. "My world is arithmetic," Beatrice said quietly, calculating how much coal to burn, how many times a skirt can be turned before it falls apart, how long I can tolerate the cruelty of my betters before my spirit breaks." Philip looked at her, truly looked at her, and Beatrice felt a sudden, terrifying lurch in her chest. It wasn't the polite, dismissive gaze of a gentleman. It was raw, stripped bare. "Your spirit won't break," Philip said softly. It is forged from stronger steel than anything in that house. He didn't offer his coat. He knew she would refuse it. Instead, he untied his horse, mounted in one fluid motion, and looked down at her one last time. "Get the boy inside, Miss Harlow. The wind is changing." He turned the horse and cantered back toward the manor, leaving Beatrice standing in the mud, her heart hammering, a frantic, dangerous rhythm against her ribs. By 8 o'clock that evening, the cold had fully set in, driving the house party indoors. The drawing room was a suffocating display of wealth and forced merriment. 3 massive fireplaces roared, turning the room into a stifling oven. The air was thick with the cloying scent of patchouli, spilled wine, and the sweat of too many bodies packed into velvet chairs. Beatrice sat at the grand pianoforte in the far corner of the room. The hired musician from the village had succumbed to an ague, leaving Lady Harrington entirely without entertainment for her guests after dinner. Panic had ensued until someone remembered the governess could play. Beatrice had been dragged from the nursery, thrust into her outdated navy silk, and ordered to provide background noise. She played Bach. It was mathematical, precise, and entirely devoid of the weeping sentimentality that Arabella favored. Her fingers moved mechanically over the ivory keys, her eyes fixed blindly on the sheet music. She blocked out the laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the loud, boastful voices of the men. She was acutely aware of exactly where the Duke of Rothwell was sitting. He was in a high-backed chair near the center of the room, surrounded by a court of sycophants. Arabella was perched on a velvet stool near his knee, leaning forward so heavily her bodice was in severe danger of failing its structural duties. Philip looked supremely bored. He stared into the fire, swirling a glass of brandy, offering only monosyllabic responses to Arabella's breathless chatter. "Miss Harlow." The voice sliced through Beatrice's concentration. She kept playing, finishing the measure before lifting her hands from the keys. She turned her head slightly. Lord Cavil stood leaning against the side of the pianoforte. He held a crystal goblet filled with dark red wine. His eyes were glassy, his face flushed with alcohol and malice. He had not forgotten the humiliation at the dinner table 2 nights prior. A man like Cavil never forgot a slight from an inferior. "You play like a metronome," Cavil slurred loudly. The conversation in the immediate vicinity died down, heads turning toward the corner. "No passion, no soul. But I suppose one cannot expect soul from a hired drudge." Beatrice kept her face utterly blank. She placed her hands neatly in her lap. "Would you prefer a different composer, my lord? I can attempt a waltz, if the mathematics of Bach displease you." Cavil's eyes narrowed. "I would prefer you learn your place." Arabella, sensing the shift in the room's attention, abandoned the Duke and glided over. "Oh, Lord Cavil, do leave the poor creature be. She doesn't know any better. Governesses are raised entirely without refinement." "She requires a lesson in humility," Cavil sneered. He leaned forward, as if to inspect the sheet music. As he did, he purposefully tilted his wrist. The heavy crystal goblet tipped. A deluge of dark, sticky red wine cascaded over the music stand, splashing across the ivory keys and raining down onto the lap of Beatrice's only decent dress. Beatrice gasped softly, a purely involuntary reaction to the cold liquid soaking through the thin silk. "Oh dear," Cavil said flatly, not sounding the least bit apologetic. "How terribly clumsy of me." A few cruel titters erupted from the surrounding guests. Lady Harrington, standing near the fireplace, watched the scene with cold detachment. If the governess was humiliated, it was her own fault for provoking a lord. The wine dripped onto the floor, staining the expensive Persian rug. "Well, don't just sit there like a stunned cow," Cavil snapped, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet drawing room. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the floor. "You are ruining Lady Harrington's rug. Get down and clean it up." Beatrice sat frozen on the piano bench. The wine felt like blood seeping into her skin. The entire room was watching her. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on her shoulders. This was the trap. If she refused, she was insubordinate, breaking the cardinal rule of service in front of 20 witnesses. She would be dismissed, blacklisted, and destitute by morning. If she complied, she accepted her degradation, allowing Cavil to strip away the final, fragile shreds of her dignity. She looked at Lady Harrington. Her employer gave a small, sharp nod toward the floor. "Clean it." Beatrice slowly closed her eyes. The arithmetic of survival was brutal. Pride did not buy bread. She pushed the bench back. It scraped loudly against the floorboards. Slowly, methodically, she stood up. The wine-soaked silk of her dress clung wetly to her legs. "A rag, Higgins," Cavil called out to the butler, who was hovering nervously near the door. "Bring the girl a rag." Beatrice didn't wait for the rag. She moved to the side of the pianoforte. She lowered her head. And then, with her back straight and her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ached, Beatrice Harlow dropped to her knees on the stained Persian rug. A collective breath of satisfaction swept through the aristocrats. The natural order of the universe had been restored. The upstart had been broken. Beatrice pulled a plain white handkerchief from her sleeve and began to dab at the spilled wine on the floorboards, keeping her eyes firmly fixed on the dark puddle. Her hands shook, a fine, violent tremor she could not control. "That's better," Cavil murmured, taking a smug sip from a fresh glass someone had instantly handed him. "A dog looks best when it is begging at its master's feet." From the center of the room, a sound cut through the air. It was the sharp, violent screech of a heavy wooden chair being pushed back with brutal force. Beatrice stopped wiping the floor. The entire drawing room turned. Philip Sinclair, the Duke of Rothwell, was standing up. Philip Sinclair did not merely stand. He uncoiled. The violent scrape of his chair legs against the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the stifling, perfumed air of the drawing room. He did not say a word. He simply walked. His heavy riding boots, still faintly scuffed with dried mud from the afternoon's hunt, swallowed the distance between the center of the room and the pianoforte in long, predatory strides. The polite, buzzing conversations died instantly. The silence that swept over the room was absolute, thick and heavy with sudden, crushing dread. Arabella froze halfway to her wine glass. Lady Harrington's pale, powdered face turned the color of old parchment. Lord Cavil, leaning against the polished wood of the instrument, attempted a smirk. It failed, contorting his face into a nervous grimace. "Your Grace," Cavil started, his voice lacking its previous sneer. He gestured flippantly toward the floor. "The clumsy girl merely needs to learn." "Shut your mouth, Cavil." Philip's voice was not loud. It did not boom. It was a low, flat rasp, completely devoid of heat. It was the voice of a man issuing a fact, not an insult. He stopped less than a foot away from the Baron. Philip was taller by several inches, broader in the shoulders and entirely still. He stared down at Cavil with a look of supreme, clinical disgust. "You are a hollow, rotting piece of wood," Philip stated. His eyes flicked over Cavil's expensive velvet coat and the diamond pin in his cravat. "Your estate in Sussex is mortgaged to the hilt. You owe £14,000 to the Crown, 6,000 to your holding banks, and you haven't paid your butcher in 11 months. You are borrowing air to breathe, Cavil. You possess nothing of value, neither in your accounts nor in your character." Cavil's face flushed a violent, ugly purple. He opened his mouth, a sputtering sound escaping his lips. but his mind short-circuited under the brutal exposure of his ruin in front of the entire ton. Philip dismissed him. He didn't even wait for a response. He simply turned his back on the Baron. He looked down at the floor. Beatrice was still on her knees. Her hands were gripping the wine-soaked handkerchief. Her navy silk dress was ruined, plastered wetly against her legs. She was looking at the Persian rug, her chest rising and falling in shallow, controlled breaths. The arithmetic of survival had frozen her in place. Philip did not issue an order. He did not tell her to rise. Instead, the Duke of Rothwell dropped to one knee. A collective, muffled gasp rippled through the aristocrats. Dukes did not kneel. They certainly did not kneel in spilled wine for the sake of a hired governess. Philip ignored the room entirely. He reached out and wrapped his large, warm hand around Beatrice's wrists, stopping her frantic, shaking attempts to scrub the stain. "Leave it," Philip said softly. Beatrice slowly lifted her head. Her brown eyes met his. There were no tears in them, only a stark, defensive pride. "It is my job to clean up the messes, Your Grace." "Not anymore." Philip took the stained handkerchief from her stiff fingers and tossed it carelessly onto Lord Cavill's polished shoes. Then he unbuttoned his own cuff. He pulled a crisp white linen square from his pocket and gently, methodically, wiped the sticky red wine from Beatrice's palms. His touch was firm, grounding her, pulling her out of the cold panic of humiliation. "Stand up, Miss Harlow," he murmured. He stood, keeping a tight grip on her right hand, and pulled her up with him. Beatrice swayed slightly as her numb legs took her weight. Philip's free hand shot out, resting heavily on the small of her back to steady her. He turned them both to face the room. The guests looked like wax figures, paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated violation of their social order. Lady Harrington was pressing a hand to her chest, looking as though she might require smelling salts. "Lady Harrington," Philip said. The icy calm in his voice was terrifying. "Your hospitality is a masterclass in depravity. I find the air in this house toxic." "Your Grace, please, you must understand," Lady Harrington stammered, stepping forward. "I understand perfectly." Philip cut her off. He looked down at the woman standing rigidly by his side. Her chin was up. She was not hiding anymore. Philip shifted his grip, moving his hand from her back to interlock his fingers with hers. He lifted her hand slightly, turning his gaze back to the horrified crowd. "You will address her with the respect she's owed," Philip declared, his eyes locking onto Cavill, then Arabella, and finally settling on Lady Harrington. He gave a sharp, formal bow of his head, directed entirely at the woman whose hand he held. "My lady." The title dropped into the room like an anvil. It was a promise. It was an absolute destruction of the hierarchy they clung to. "Higgins!" Philip called out without looking away from the crowd. The butler materialized from the doorway, pale and shaking. Yes, Your Grace." "Tell my valet to pack my trunks. Have my carriage brought around to the front steps. Now." Philip didn't wait for the butler's confirmation. He tightened his hold on Beatrice's hand and walked her straight through the center of the drawing room. The lords and ladies parted like the sea, scrambling backward to avoid brushing against them. They walked out the double doors, leaving the stifling heat and the silence of the drawing room behind them. The nursery was bitterly cold. The fire had died down to a few grey embers. Beatrice moved with mechanical efficiency. She dragged her trunk from under the narrow cot and flipped the brass latches. She threw her few possessions inside: the heavy woolen stockings, the spare grey dress, the worn copy of Locke. She'd left the navy silk ruined on the floor. She was ruined. That much was certain. A governess who allowed a duke to humiliate a baron on her behalf was unemployable. The gossip would reach London before the week was out. She would be branded an opportunist, a seductress, or simply a liability. But as she buckled the leather straps of her trunk, Beatrice realized something strange. Her hands had stopped shaking. The heavy, suffocating pressure that had sat on her chest since she first arrived at the Harrington estate was gone. The cage door had been blown off its hinges. She was walking into the freezing winter of destitution, but she was walking out on her own 2 feet. She did not take the servants' stairs. Beatrice hauled her trunk down the grand, sweeping staircase in the center of the house. Let them see her. The entrance hall was a hive of frantic, muted activity. Footmen were hauling heavy leather trunks out the front doors. The biting night air poured in, smelling of impending frost. Beatrice dragged her trunk across the marble floor. Miss Harlow, Lady Harrington, stood in the doorway of the library. Her face was a mask of furious, terrified spite. You have destroyed us. The Duke is leaving. Lord Cavil is threatening a duel. You are a plague on this house. You will leave without a reference. You will leave without your wages. Beatrice stopped. She let go of the leather handle of her trunk. She turned to face her former employer. Keep the wages, my lady, Beatrice said, her voice perfectly level. Apply them to your candle budget. The darkness in this house is profound. She grabbed the handle and walked out the front doors. The night was pitch black, lit only by the carriage lanterns throwing harsh yellow circles onto the gravel drive. A sleek, uncrested black carriage stood waiting, a matched pair of massive grey geldings stamping their hooves impatiently, blowing white steam from their nostrils. Philip Sinclair was standing beside the open carriage door. He wore a heavy, dark driving coat, the collar turned up against the wind. He watched Beatrice haul her trunk down the stone steps. He did not offer to help her carry it. He simply waited until she reached the gravel. Where do you intend to go? Philip asked. The village inn, Beatrice replied, keeping her eyes on the heavy iron gates at the end of the long drive. There is a mail coach that passes through at dawn. I have enough coin for a ticket to Bristol. And what is in Bristol? Arithmetic, Your Grace, the calculation of how to survive another week. She gripped the handle of her trunk tighter. I appreciate your intervention in the drawing room, but you have fundamentally accelerated my demise. I liberated you from a madhouse, Philip countered flatly. You performed a highly entertaining piece of theatre, Beatrice corrected him, finally looking at him. You proved a point to your peers, but you returned to a warm estate, and I return to the streets. The ledgers are not balanced. Philip stepped away from the carriage. He closed the space between them until he was standing directly in front of her, forcing her to look up into his harsh, angular face. I despise theatre, Philip said softly. I despise polite society. I despise the simpering fools who occupy it, and I utterly despise the expectation that I must suffer them. He reached down and placed his hand over hers on the handle of the trunk. I am 32 years old, Miss Harlow. I have no heirs. I have estates in Yorkshire that span thousands of acres, shipping lanes that require constant auditing, and a fortune that makes me a target for every grasping mother in England. I require a partner. Beatrice froze. The biting wind whipped her brown hair around her face, but she felt completely still. You require an estate manager. I require a wife, Philip said. The word held no romance. It was a statement of architectural necessity. I am entirely devoid of sentimental illusions. I do not want a woman who swoons over poetry or faints at the sight of spilled wine. I want a woman who calculates the cost of the candelabras. I want a woman who looks at a baron and sees his debts. You calculate the cost of survival. I calculate the cost of power. Combined, we would be impregnable. Beatrice stared at him. Her mind, conditioned to analyze facts and reject fairy tales, scrambled to find the trap. You are proposing marriage to a governess because she did mental arithmetic at dinner? I am proposing marriage to a woman who possesses a spine forged from iron, Philip corrected. You see the cage. You understand the bars. You will not try to decorate it with useless lace. We see the world the exact same way, Beatrice. It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded strange in his rough voice, grounded, real. It would be a marriage of ledgers, Beatrice said slowly, testing the weight of the reality. The most honest kind, Philip agreed. He did not step closer. He did not try to kiss her. He offered her the one thing no one in her entire life had ever offered her: respect. Philip stepped back and gestured toward the open door of the black carriage. I leave for Yorkshire tonight. The roads are terrible, the journey will be miserable, and my estates are brutally cold. He looked at her, his dark eyes waiting. Do we balance the books together, Miss Harlowe? Beatrice looked at the carriage. She looked back at the sprawling, crumbling facade of the Harrington estate, a monument to pretense and cruelty. Then she looked at the Duke. She let go of the trunk. Put that on the back, Beatrice said to Philip's valet, who was standing quietly near the horses. She walked past Philip and climbed into the carriage. Philip's mouth twitched. It was the ghost of a true smile. He followed her inside, pulling the door shut behind them. The lock clicked, a heavy, final sound. The driver cracked the whip, and the carriage surged forward into the dark. 6 months later, the wind howled across the Yorkshire moors, a violent, relentless force that battered against the 3-foot-thick stone walls of Rothwell Hall. It was a brutal, unforgiving landscape of jagged rock and bruised, sprawling heather. There were no manicured topiary gardens here, no delicate gravel paths designed for polite afternoon strolls. The estate was a fortress of dark granite and roaring hearths, built for survival and endurance against a climate that actively despised human habitation. Beatrice sat in the main study, enveloped in the heavy, comforting scent of wood smoke, old leather, and binding glue. The room was vast, lined from the wide plank oak floor to the vaulted ceiling with books, ledgers, and rolled maritime shipping charts. The mahogany desk anchoring the center of the room was the size of a small dining table, currently buried under a snowdrift of invoices and crop yield reports. She was not wearing grey bombazine. The scratchy, oppressive uniform of her previous life had been burned in the courtyard on her second day in Yorkshire. Instead, she wore a dress of deep, rich burgundy wool. It was completely unadorned, lacking any lace, ruffles, or ridiculous puff sleeves that would catch on a desk corner. It was entirely practical, incredibly warm, and tailored to fit the sharp, capable lines of her frame. Her hair was still pulled back to keep it out of the ink, but the severe, scalp-aching knot had loosened. Soft, dishwater brown strands fell freely around her face, catching the amber light of the fire. She dragged a silver fountain pen across a thick piece of parchment, leaving a column of precise, unyielding black numbers in its wake. Her marriage to the Duke of Rothwell had detonated in London like a powder keg. The gossip columns had run entirely wild for a month. Wagers were placed in the betting books at White's regarding how quickly the Duke would tire of his plain, penniless bride and banish her to a dower house. The aristocrats predicted disaster, ruin, and an eventual, deeply messy divorce. They assumed it was a bizarre, temporary madness. Philip and Beatrice had ignored the noise completely. They simply never returned to London. Instead, they tore into the Rothwell estate management with the ruthless precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Philip handled the physical boundaries, the volatile land disputes with neighboring barons, and the rough, uncompromising captains of his merchant fleet in Hull. Beatrice took the books, She had spent the first 2 months gutting the archaic accounting systems that had allowed middlemen to bleed the estate dry. She fired 3 corrupt stewards, restructuring the agricultural investments and renegotiating the coal mining leases. She did not yell. She did not throw tantrums. She simply presented the offending men with a ledger detailing their exact thefts, and gave them 1 hour to vacate the property before she summoned the magistrate. They ran. Within 6 months, the Duke's already massive income had increased by a staggering margin. The Ton stopped laughing when the bank accounts grew. Fear rapidly replaced their mockery. The heavy oak door creaked open, the iron hinges protesting slightly. Philip walked in, bringing the sharp, biting smell of frost and wet dog with him. He wore a thick woolen sweater over a rough linen shirt, his riding boots tracking a small amount of dried mud onto the edge of the Persian rug. He looked deeply, fundamentally tired, but the exhaustion was physical, earned from 10 hours in the saddle, inspecting the eastern boundary lines. It was a clean exhaustion. The hollow, soul-crushing boredom he had worn in the drawing rooms of Somerset was entirely gone. He walked over to a side table, uncorking a crystal decanter and pouring 2 glasses of dark, peaty whiskey. He brought one to the desk, setting it down carefully near Beatrice's inkwell so the condensation wouldn't ruin her parchment. "The tenant farms in the valley have finished repairing their roofs," Philip said, leaning a hip against the solid edge of the mahogany desk. He picked up one of the heavy ledgers she had pushed aside, flipping open the cover. "Your estimates on the Welsh slate costs were accurate to the penny." "Naturally," Beatrice murmured, her eyes not lifting from the column of numbers she was currently conquering. The quarry manager in Leeds was attempting to inflate the shipping cost by a margin of 15%, banking on aristocratic ignorance. I sent him a letter detailing the actual cost of cartage per mile, factoring in the current price of oats for the draft horses. I informed him that if he did not adjust his invoice, we would buy a quarry and put him out of business. Philip chuckled, a low, warm rumble that vibrated in his chest. I suspect he was terrified. He was merely educated on the facts of the market. Beatrice finally set her silver pen down, rubbing a small smudge of black ink from her thumb. She picked up the heavy crystal glass, taking a slow sip of the burning liquid. It slid down her throat, settling as a warm knot in her stomach. "A letter arrived with the afternoon post rider," Philip said. The amusement faded from his voice, replaced by a flat, clinical detachment. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of cream-colored stationery. The paper was expensive, but it was badly folded, heavily scented with a fading, desperate lavender perfume. He tossed it onto the center of the desk. "It is from Lady Harrington." Beatrice looked at the broken red wax seal. She didn't hesitate. She unfolded the thick paper, her face remaining a mask of perfect, passive observation as she scanned the frantic, slanted handwriting. "Lord Cavill fled to the continent last month to escape his creditors," Beatrice summarized, her voice entirely devoid of gloating. It was a simple recitation of data. He defaulted entirely on a massive gambling debt that Lord Harrington, in a desperate bid to secure Arabella a title, had foolishly underwritten. The creditors have seized the Harrington townhouse in London. They are currently facing foreclosure on the Somerset estate. "She is begging for a loan," Philip noted, picking up his own whiskey. "She appeals directly to your charitable Christian nature and spends 3 paragraphs reminding you of the fond memories you supposedly shared under her roof." Beatrice picked up the letter by the corner, holding it between 2 fingers as if it were a dead mouse found in the pantry. She looked at the elegant, shaking script. She remembered the freezing nursery. She remembered the bruising apples and the stale bread. She remembered the spilled red wine soaking into her only decent dress, and the absolute, chilling certainty in Lady Harrington's eyes that a governess was nothing but disposable meat. Beatrice stood up. Her burgundy skirt swept heavily over the floorboards as she walked toward the massive stone fireplace roaring at the far end of the study. She did not tear the letter in a fit of dramatic revenge. She simply opened her fingers and dropped it into the roaring flames. The expensive cream paper curled instantly, blackened at the edges, and vanished into a fragile wisp of grey ash in a matter of seconds. "The mathematics of cruelty," Beatrice said quietly, watching the fire consume the last of the Harrington pride. "It eventually bankrupts the soul, and if left unchecked, it bankrupts the estate. It is a terrible investment. We are not a charity, Your Grace." Philip walked up behind her. He did not wrap his arms around her waist, nor did he attempt to whisper flowery poetry into her ear. He stood shoulder to shoulder with her, a solid, unmoving wall of heat and presence, staring into the exact same fire. He reached out, his large, calloused hand brushing against the side of her head. He gently tucked a stray lock of dishwater brown hair behind her ear. The touch was heavy, possessive, and profoundly real. "No, we are not," Philip agreed softly, his voice barely rising above the crackle of the burning logs. "We are entirely factual." Beatrice leaned into his hand, just a fraction of an inch, grounding herself in the quiet, unyielding strength of the man beside her. The ledgers were balanced, the cage was broken, and for the first time in her life, the arithmetic added up perfectly. If you found yourself holding your breath while Beatrice balanced the scales of justice and love, you are not alone. True romance isn't always found in fairy tale balls. Sometimes it's built on quiet respect, unwavering truth, and standing up to the bullies of the world. Did Philip's brutal takedown of Lord Cavil give you chills? Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this story with fellow historical drama lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more deeply human, grounded tales of resilience and romance.